Welcome, everybody. So, I am quite not sure yet what I should be more excited about. Is it speaking to a Drupal audience after 7 years for the first time again? Or is it the prospect of sledding down a mountain tonight after having fondue? But we will figure that out, and I hope that you will enjoy both experiences. So today I want to run my keynote on the topic of running the internet underfunded and understaffed, and seeing how we can achieve a sustainable open source ecosystem. So I think the title is quite a mouthful. So I think in a nutshell, it is just how can we create open source software while still being able to make a living? Now, what do I mean when I'm talking about economic sustainability? It is that the open source project has funding to continue operations and for years to come. So it's not only about having financial security for the next 2 to 3 months or so. It is about being able to plan long-term and strategically. So today I want to discuss sustainable business and funding models for open source projects. But let's not make this too academic now, because at least for me, this is totally personal. Over the last 20 years, I built my career on open source software, building and scaling successful companies based on it. So even back in university, I wrote my diploma thesis on how to migrate from proprietary databases to open source databases. And I wanted to build a company based on that, but there was just no market. So that did not work out for a successful business model. But then back in 2006, I founded my own software development agency, implementing projects for clients in the public and in the for-profit, in the private sector. And we built our projects on a standard LAMP stack. And after some forays into Plone and MediaWiki and GeForge, we settled on Drupal, becoming one of the major providers of Drupal-based solutions in Germany. Now that was quite a successful business model, and it sustained a team of 15 highly skilled employees over many years. But how did we contribute to sustaining the open source projects we built our success on? Now at Data in Transit, we applied a mix of various kinds of contributions. Like for Drupal, we attended hackathons and contributed code. We sponsored events and marketing material. We evangelized with our clients. We shared knowledge, and we supported the Drupal Association with our membership. But for other parts of our stack, as I said, we built on Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, we definitely cared way too little for the shoulders that we were standing on, just simply taking for granted the existence of a wealth of supporting code, tools, and knowledge. We did not give anything back from the revenues we created, making use of other people's work. Now, fast forward 10 years, when I led IO, which is an international software development company, and I was for 5 years their COO and CTO, and now I was part and in charge of a proper open source project, namely Adblock Plus. Now, for Adblock Plus, luckily the question of how to sustain that project had already been solved in 2011, when IO as a company was set up by the project maintainer, Vladimir Paland, and his 2 co-founders. So the profitable business model that they identified was that they were letting ads through the ad blocker, but only those that complied with the acceptable ads criteria. And then they charged a service fee for allow listing these ads to the websites running the ads. And that was quite profitable. And even additionally, individual users of Adblock Plus were willing to donate to the project and later also to buy a premium subscription to get access to advanced features. So yeah, well done, IO. But finding such an ingenious business model is rare. So what I currently do is that I support other projects that are still looking for finding ways to a long-term sustainability. Mailvelop, which I'm currently leading as their interim CEO, is a great showcase for the challenges that open source projects face with regards to their long-term sustainability. Now, Mailvelop, which is a solution to easily encrypt web mailers, it's been on the market for over 10 years now. And while it is web mailer agnostic, so you can use it with any mail client running on a browser, it is also integrated by all major German web mailers as their encryption offering of choice. And the German Federal Office for Information Security, the BSI, it uses this technology to encrypt its own email offering. And additionally, dozens of international media outlets and journalists, they suggest their sources of the information to use Mailvelop as their mail encryption tool of choice to ensure confidentiality of their communication. And that's, for example, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, the Zeit. And still, Mailvelop is run only by a very, very small team of 3 people, with only 1 developer. For the last 10 years, the project was funded based on grants and a very small income for its premium offering, Mailvelop Business, featuring a Google Workspace integration. There is 0 income generated from the third parties that are building their tools and offerings based on it. Now, if that 1 developer would be run over by a bus, or burn out, or retire, or just simply move on, the German web mailers would lose their encryption functionality. And most news outlets would lose their capability to communicate safely with their sources. Luckily, all of this did not happen yet, and hopefully never will. But do we want to build our tools, our business, and our internet infrastructure on hopes? Now, I think this is the point when all of these ramblings about the dire state of open source sustainability get to the point where this seminal XKCD cartoon has to be shown. I want to use it as a segue now to move from my own experience that I just shared to a broader evaluation of the state of economic sustainability for open source projects. Because we find the pattern of the Mailvelop case that I just shared in many parts of the open source ecosystem. For example, this year, 2024, we see the 10th anniversary of the disclosure of Heartbleed, which was an OpenSSL bug allowing for a massive exploit of that key encryption library. At the time of disclosure, around 17% of the internet's secure web servers, which was at that time around 500,000, were believed to be vulnerable to the attack. It allowed the theft of the server's private keys and the user session cookies and passwords, making this, according to Wikipedia, the worst vulnerability found since commercial traffic began to flow on the internet. When Heartbleed was discovered, OpenSSL was maintained by a handful of volunteers, only 1 of who worked full-time. And yearly donations to the OpenSSL projects were around $2,000. So this is a quote from one of the OpenSSL maintainers. The mystery is not that a few overworked volunteers missed this bug. The mystery is why this hasn't happened more often. So OpenSSL was and still is only one of many examples of that problem of running the internet underfunded and understaffed. And for example, a year later only, GNU-PG and its maintainer Werner Koch made the headlines announcing that he would have to discontinue developing GNU-PG as he had simply no funds left. But these events, they led to some shifts in the overall ecosystem, with the big tech players stepping up and donating at least a tiny bit of their revenues to help the struggling projects. So, for example, the core infrastructure initiatives was set up, where many large companies donated funds to it. Also, GitHub sponsors is a means where companies can contribute back. And there were also like governmental player, like in Germany, the Sovereign Tech Fund was set up with a clear intention to ensure the sustainability of open source projects. And still, when we're looking at the numbers this year, it is still the case that in looking at the results of the open source security report, nearly all of the surveyed code bases included open source software, but 50% of these code bases included open source software that had no developer activity in the last 2 years. And on the other hand, currently around 60% of open source maintainers describe themselves as unpaid hobbyists, and 44% said that they are the only person maintaining a project. So only 3 years ago, we saw this problem happening again, that too much of infrastructure was built on projects run by a very small number of people when major Log4j vulnerabilities were discovered. Now, overall, with the current setup, there was and still is a huge risk involved in building infrastructure on open source software. And the same goes for like any key processes in companies or society, like encrypted communication, ad blocking, or web browsing. Now, I think we all want to promote open source software, but then we need to address this risk and solve the puzzle of how to make a living by building open source software. So to get a clearer perspective on that, let's look into the economics of open source. So let's first visit open source Happy Land. This is like what we tell others when we want to advocate for open source software. At its core, creating open source is about voluntary unpaid work. And this is good because it is about individuals who want to scratch their own itch, and by others contributing because they find the code useful. And by that, all of them are improving the quality of the software because, you know, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Also, the results of that process are highly innovative due to the collective intelligence unlocked by collaboration and knowledge sharing. And the user experience, it is just awesome because all users can be contributors as well and participate directly in the improvement of the software. Now, I think that's the theory. In practice, attracting more contributors to a project, this creates the need for more organization, for governance, for leadership, meaning setting up an organization with specific roles, structures, and processes. More users, on the other hand, means that also the number of free riders only using the software without contributing back increases. But at the same time, these users ask questions, they look for documentation, they find unexpected ways to break the software, and they complain. To cope, some sort of user support needs to be set up, at least in a basic form of a public forum. It needs to be moderated as well. And all of this creates work, and it takes time way beyond volunteering some lines of code in one's spare time. In a nutshell, the combination of voluntarism in creating code and a not-for-profit approach to freely sharing the code is only feasible for projects that are low maintenance, which means they require little work for maintaining them and supporting the users. But successful open source projects, on the other hand, they are work intensive, both for maintaining and developing the code as well as for intending to its users. And with that, the voluntary, not-for-profit nature of working on open source projects, it becomes its worst enemy. Because now the developers have to become community managers, fundraisers, customer support, and so on. And with that, it stifles innovation. It decreases the quality of the products. It burns out the maintainers and sometimes leaves them broke. And I think it just takes the fun out of it. So I think we are looking at a vicious circle where a lack of funding leads to a lack of contributors, leading to a lack of product development or fundraising or business development, which again then aggravates the lack of funding. Now, how can we get out of this vicious cycle? Let me now walk you through some of the most common business models and funding schemes and see what we can learn then from real-world examples. Now here I tried to map some models against two axes. One is on the left side, how the funds received can be used. Are they restricted to a specific area or topic, or are they unrestricted? On the x-axis, you see how much effort beyond improving the software itself has to be spent to get to the funding or the revenues. And for the color coding, yellow means funding or patronage models, and purple means commercial solutions. Now, when we look at that matrix, we see, for example, having a paid contributor in a project means that to get that funding is very low effort beyond the product work. And it's just that person is getting paid. But the funds are quite restricted. They are restricted to paying that one person. You can't use the funds for hosting or something like that. In the other quadrant, for example, looking at paid services, if you find a way to build paid services on top of your open source project, these are unrestricted. You can use them for whatever you like. But you will have to spend a high effort into providing the services that can't go into developing your open source project. Now, let's look at two other differentiators to understand that landscape a bit better. And one is, when we're looking at non-profit funding models, that whether it is the project that receives the funds or whether it is a specific person getting paid. Like a person getting paid, this could be via a universal basic income or, as I said, a paid contributor, while when the project receives the funds, this can be via grants, for example, or donations and such. Then looking at another differentiator that is mainly in the for-profit sector, this is whether the project is able to generate the revenue by selling services on top of the product that may or may not be directly related to the product. Like this can be consulting or training or certifications, for example, or the IO and AdBlock Plus case that I just shared. And on the other hand, schemes where the revenue is coming directly from product sales, like, for example, a freemium, so free and premium offering, dual licensing, or the idea of an open core, where only the core of the product is open source and the rest is on a proprietary license. Sorry. Now, let's make this more tangible by looking at some concrete examples. We already looked a bit at AdBlock Plus, and I shared with you that this project is funded by ads in the end, based on IO's acceptable ads revenue, where the ad blocker is letting through the ads that are on the allow list. There's also a premium offering for the B2C users, and there is the opportunity to donate to that project, which is also working quite well because people just love the software. Now let's look at Drupal that we all know. Here there is a very huge mix of funding for that project that is developed by a community. We see around 20 core contributors, but over 100,000 people contributing to that project. And that gets funded by donations, for example, donations to the Drupal Association, grants given from the Drupal Association, sponsorships, paid contributors, and also paid services. So I think anybody working in a Drupal shop, like the one that I set up, we deliver paid services built on that open source project, and with that we can finance the contribution that we give to the project itself. Another project that I also mentioned briefly is GNU-PG, and it is developed by this one guy in Germany, now having set up a small company. And GNU-PG is funded by public funds mainly. In Germany, there was money for GPG for Win and the VS desktop. Also, when I set up some crowdfunding that for quite a long while was not successful at all, not being able to make a living from that. But after he put out the threat that he was going broke that I just shared, then the revenue coming from crowdfunding, it increased quite a bit. Donations as well, the donations were really, really small to that project, but when the threat that he would just leave and quit came up, he received donations by larger companies like Stripe, for example, or Facebook. And via his company, G10, he's also into paid services. So again, quite a mix of funding. And then, as I shared before, Mailvelope developed only by one person, funded by various grants and also paid subscription. And then there's another example of Mozilla Firefox. There is the Mozilla Foundation and the Mozilla Corporation, both putting money into developing the code for the browser. And it's funded by donations to the Mozilla Foundation. But there's also a huge bucket of paid services, quite similar to the ABP case, because the paid services that the Mozilla Corporation is offering is mainly to Google being the default search engine in the browser. With that, if people use that search engine, they are looking at and clicking through the ads that Google is serving on its search engine, and that makes for the revenues. So again, kind of an ad-financed business model, and these work quite nicely when an open source project is the gatekeeper. Like AdBlock Plus is the gatekeeper around the ad blocking area, and here the access to being the main search engine in the browser is also quite valuable. Last, let's look at MySQL, because that's the most prominent example of dual licensing. They've been doing that already since 1995, which is now 30 years. And I just see that the donations are wrong here. It is funded by the revenues generated by MySQL AB. And they come from the paid product that they are offering, because they are offering the GPL license to any use that creates code that is also under the GPL, and for any use case that does not want to put the source code under a free software license, they offer their proprietary licenses. Now, looking at this small set of examples, there are some learnings that we can draw from them. So we see projects that are in a way sustainable. They are here for nearly 10 years, like in the case of MySQL, or also GNU-PG, which has been around since 1997. And we also see that diversification in terms of funding is definitely key, like having a good mix of non-profit and for-profit revenues. Longevity, I think, is mainly built on a couple of things that can be done right, where the first is simple, like just keeping it small. If you're keeping the personnel costs small, then you can thrive on a very small budget, like is the case for GNU-PG and Mailvelop. Another way would be to find a profitable paid services business model, for example, like ads, like in the cases of AdBlock Plus and Firefox. Building a profitable paid services ecosystem, like in the case of Drupal, is also a way to go. Dual licensing, we have seen that with MySQL. And then in the area of funds and fundraising, securing grants, like in the case of Mailvelop, and looking at unrestricted grants mainly, so that you can like also drive the operations of the project and not only have the funds for one specific feature or person. The same goes for securing donations like GNU-PG did and Firefox, but that also again makes sense if they are quite large and not only limited to a specific time span. So now when we come back to the overall topic of economic sustainability, I want to highlight this part here, that it is about funding to continue operations for years to come. So that what you want to achieve is income that is plannable for years ahead. Because only that enables long-term strategic planning, like a product roadmap, innovation, and also a healthy strategy of how to attract and retain contributors. Now, there are a couple of like no-goes that open source projects should definitely beware, like solutions that rely on something like a tip jar economy, where the donations are really, really small and not secured. Also, where funds are restricted to only building one specific feature, or one-time donations that will not help to achieve financial sustainability. Like overall, any first code and then pray for pay scheme, they are always a poor substitute for a steady paycheck, because it puts the maintainers under severe risk without health or requirement benefits. And I think overall, getting paid for creating open source software should not be something that the maintainer should have to hope or ask or beg for. It should be safe and long-term, and they should be properly entitled to it. Which means that as a society, we need to find ways to A, stop free riding, and B, let the creators of open source software be fairly paid for their contributions to the public good. So to complete the landscape of funding and business models for open source software, I suggest to add 2 more models. So one would be to set up a public fund based on taxes, mainly corporate taxes, and then pay that out to open source maintainers with no strings attached and with a long-term security on that. In Germany, the Sovereign Tech Fund is going into that direction, and I hope it will be something that they are moving into more. In the US, the Open Source Software Trust is at least an idea that is worked on that would also achieve something like that. The other area is find some proper licensing scheme that requires company to pay money to the open source projects when they build commercial tooling on top of them, when they are using it in some kind of commercial setup. So these 2 options, I think, would perfectly complete what we already see on the open source funding landscape, but I'd be happy to discuss this later in our Q&A session. Now, let me close this keynote by highlighting the special day we have today. We are celebrating International Women's Day. And with that, all the awesome female contributors and maintainers of open source software. But looking around in that room and looking at the numbers, even today, female contributors are only a tiny minority in this mostly white male ecosystem. Now, how is that fact related to the topic of economic sustainability that we are looking at today? Now, in general, marginalized people in tech, like women, people of color, people with disabilities, LGBTIQ people, and others, they often have less free time for a few major reasons. Like they are responsible for dependent care, for domestic work, running errands, and there is a huge pay equity. With women doing 9 hours more unpaid work per week than men, plus also earning €5 less per hour than men, and these are German numbers from last year, how can we expect women to contribute to open source software when that requires spending spare time they don't have on another topic that they are not going to get paid for? So the question is, could efforts to increase the sustainability of free and open source software directly have effects on gender diversity? And for me, the answer is a big yes. If you can make a decent living from creating open source software, this will also encourage and enable women to contribute. And with that, open source sustainability is not only key for a thriving ecosystem, it also enables diversity in our communities. Thanks so much for listening. Now I would like to open the floor for questions and comments.
I like your proposition about these new licensing schemes. My question is, what license do you have in mind that is already popular today? Yeah. And also, how do we, for example, Drupal is GPL2, which wouldn't allow me to package or repackage and do another licensing. I'm wondering what you think about it.
Yeah, so it is definitely not easy because having such a license would currently be against the open source definition, because there it says that you can modify any derivative work as long as it is put under a open source license again, and it does not limit the options for using that software. It is totally open for any kind of usage, including commercial usages, as long as the code is kept open. But I think that's for many situations, that is just not sufficient. So what we are seeing at Maildevelop, for example, is like that the software is still offered to the customers or to the users in its open source form. It is a downloadable browser extension, but it is becoming part of a larger commercial package and thus increasing the revenue of the offering third party. And there, in these cases, we would like to ensure that part of that revenue goes back to the open source project. So you asked about whether there are licenses that offer that. And in my research, I only found one, which is called the Sustainable License. And that says exactly that, like if the project is used in a commercial setup, it is this is the one use that is denied without payment. Now, this is not widespread. It is still something that is already assessed by lawyers. So there is something that has quite some validation, but it is not widely used, I think, for exactly that reason, that it would change the way that we look at open source software and free software in general. So I think it requires a larger discussion in the overall open source communities, whether this is something that we want, whether this is something that would be a danger to the idea of open source, or whether it would in the end be a benefit, because it would increase the sustainability of the projects. Questions? And I can share the link to that sustainable license later in the Slack channel.
Hi, Jutta. Thank you so much for your talk today. I especially appreciate that you were giving us solutions, like both ones that already exist and proposing some new ones. I really liked the idea that you had about the licensing being tiered once you get to a certain level. And there are some that exist, like it's not in open source, but like the Unity game development software tool, you know, you can use it on the personal level and it can be free, but once you reach certain thresholds of income, then you have to go up to the next license. I know that's not like quite open source, but I wonder what you think about that. I know you mentioned that it might kill the spirit of open source, but at the same time, if we kill open source, does it even have a spirit?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I totally agree with you. So that's my thinking as well. It is a major change that where we would need a lot of conversation and consensus about in the overall community. It's not something that can be just done. For sure, it can be done by like single projects, just changing that way. Sorry, thank you. But I think having that as a larger movement throughout the ecosystem would be way more valuable, because currently the open source definition is not only for us like internally, it is also something that funding, for example, is bound to. Like there are funds like in Germany, the Prototype Fund, where you only receive the funding if you adhere to the current open source definition. So this conversation and that understanding why it would make sense to add that kind of licensing would like have to cover every party connected to this ecosystem.
Yes, I was missing a bit the idea of a marketplace, not necessarily connected with closed code things. I've been challenging the association since more than 10 years with this topic, and everyone is like, no, that's not possible, it's not real open source. But it's hard, maybe people don't understand. What I mean is basically connecting maintainers with end users. Maybe, you know, the actual, like, whoever maybe goes through agencies and is maybe not even aware, but there's a total disconnect of maintainers from, like, what are you actually doing as the end users. I mean, like, let them participate in decision processes, or maybe doing something, it's more like a service level agreement where you're available in case of questions, you know, consulting, which is more like less specific hour-based services or less the product itself. It's also related to maybe risk management of the whole investment, because you have a connection to whoever does that. And I don't get why everyone is kind of fighting against the idea of doing a marketplace in Drupal, or no one really cares about doing this.
Could you please elaborate how you think that this marketplace would help with funding and business models? I did not get, I totally get the part of getting the user into the game, but how is that connected in your thinking to funding?
Well, if you see the marketplace as convenience, even sometimes there are, like at WordPress or so, sometimes you can download something through the marketplace and it's convenient. People do this, pay for it, into hundreds of thousands of users. So that's a lot of money per year or so. They even pay for subscriptions, even if you could download it through GitHub or so with a manual workflow. And that's a significant amount of money. We have like, maybe we maintain things that have like 700,000 installations, and we like have almost zero, you know.
Yeah. So something like paid themes and paid modules and something like that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, even if they're freely available, yes, you can kind of pay for it.
Yeah.
Like on the platform, that's the most important part, like in Drupal itself.
Yeah, got it. Any other comments or suggestions, questions?
Thanks for the thoughts that you shared. I just have one thing that came to my mind just now is I heard before in discussions that for companies it is sometimes legally complicated or difficult to donate money. And that marketplace thing actually could be a thing because a company has legally no problem of buying something. And I mean, they can choose to buy it even if they could also get it for free, which maybe happens or probably happens in some cases.
Yeah.
But they're legally sometimes not allowed to donate money like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's one part, I think, is the legal aspect. The other is just a simple organizational aspect. So a development team might have a budget for buying tools, but they most probably won't have a budget for donating to any organization. So making sure that it's as easy as possible to generate funds for open source projects is definitely a good thing. So for example, GitHub Sponsors, which is moving a bit into that direction, allowed for a big increase of small and large donations to open source projects.
I had a question/observation from listening to everyone's contributions in the room. I feel like Drupal 7 and backwards, right, when we were open source, like that made sense. We had a lot more hobbyists. But one thing that I've seen is that from Drupal 8 forward, it seems like maintaining Drupal projects requires more specialized professional knowledge. And so, not that I don't want Drupal to be open source, but it does seem like this is a very good time to evaluate our funding models. So thank you for this conversation.
That's a good point, and something that I find quite interesting, because as you've seen on the picture that I showed in the beginning, I left like the Drupal community with the advent of Drupal 8, and back then everybody was discussing what is this move going to do with the Drupal community, will the hobbyists leave and such. But I think in Drupal specifically, because it's not really a B2C product, and with Drupal 8, it got less of one. It is something that you are meant to build paid services on. This, I think, allows for a quite healthy ecosystem and making money based on that, at least if you are an agency building projects. The problem, though, is still how to get part of that money back to the contributors, by paid contributors, by donations, by being a member of the Drupal associations and such. So this loop has always to be closed. I think there was another.
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to quickly throw in an idea that we are following at Factorio for some years now, and that is kind of like a voluntary contribution in terms of contribution time that is dedicated to our team. So we have something called the contribution days, and that kind of like enables every employee at the company to invest 80 hours a year paid work for their own open source projects. And yeah, I think there are benefits coming from that, not only for the company being seen as a company investing into open source and in the community, but also for the employees, because they don't have to do like over hours working on their projects, because they can just do that during the regular working hours, so to say. And on the other hand, that also helps, of course, kind of like pushing the modules forward that they maintain, creating new functionalities and stuff, which at the end of the day also benefits potential clients, because then they can kind of rely on a bigger, better developed, maintained module at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the best practices in that area. So what I see emerging in many companies is what is called OSPOs, Open Source Program Offices, where you have really a kind of team or function in a company, making sure that these strategies are developed and followed, like whether it be contributing time or donating a specific amount of money, making sure that there is a decision process, like is it top-down or is it coming from the teams, on which tools to spend money, like companies are like publishing their tech radar, and then for which of these projects they are donating regularly. All of this really helps to increase the awareness and make this a more smooth and regular process. And this regularity, I think that's so important to ensure the long-term sustainability that I've been talking about, so that it's not a one-off, but something that the projects also can rely on, that over the year we will get that amount of time donated or money donated.
Yeah, I was going on this way about companies contributing and offering employees to contribute to a project, because you mentioned that for now there was some kind of funds coming from the government. What I'm a bit skeptic about this is how they are redistributing these funds. Because if you look at Drupal Foundation and all these things, they are receiving money just for the Drupal project, because it's companies that are believing the Drupal project. When you give money to the government, you never really know how they are reallocating this money.
Yeah. So the funds that I mentioned, they are transparent, but still the problem exists that you're mentioning, because to achieve that transparency on where the funds are spent, they need two things from the projects inquiring about these funds. First, these projects need to set up a very detailed project plan with all of the topics that they want to spend on and why, and advocate for all of this. And then when they have gotten the grant, they need to do regular reporting. So I see that at Maildevelop, this is quite an effort that we are doing regularly to do fundraising on the one hand, and then to report on the funds that we received. So it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, it creates the transparency on what the money is spent on, but it is a massive overhead put on the projects that they can't put into improving the product itself. So that's why when I showed you that landscape of funding and business models, grants is rather in the area of high amount of work that is not going into the product directly.
Yeah, thanks as well from my side. When I look at the sponsors, it's mostly like companies that have like a platform where people pay into it regularly, that want to have the visibility and sponsor events like the Drupal Mountain Camp. How do you see the landscape? Like, should we get more money from the platforms, or should we get more money from the end user, the customer, or the agencies? Where do you see the best ways to get the funds from, or is it the government? I don't know, like trusts.
So for Drupal, that's a tough question for me. As I said, I'm 7 years out of the game, so I don't think that I have a good enough grasp of what makes the most sense. Looking back at 7 years ago, I would have definitely gone along the path of the agencies, because that was quite a thriving economy with a lot of revenues generated and still pretty little giving back. So I think back then, and I think today as well, the platforms are more committed to, because they are building a whole infrastructure and their own products on Drupal, on and around Drupal. While the agencies, they are doing Drupal, but probably also other like web projects and such. It's not that close connection necessarily. So focusing on involving them closer. And I had an interesting conversation last night at the dinner with, I don't know whether he's here, Nicolas from right over there, with the struggles you are having in France with your Drupal association, where it is hard to get companies to give back a dedicated amount of their revenues. So I think that should be something that, the community could stress more, that this is key to stay part of the ecosystem.
Thanks. Yeah. On tomorrow we'll also have a session about Drupal localization updates, so we can exchange about the challenges that France, Switzerland, Belgium. Not sure if any other association representatives are here, you can also join us for that session where we basically exchange about the local SSH updates. Are there more comments or questions for Jutta?
Then I just want to close that with an offering from Maildevelop. If you now got interested into encrypting your webmail conversation, especially your Gmail workspace setup in your company, feel free to come over to me. I'm giving out vouchers for our subscription, so that would be directly funding an open source project while giving you the access to encrypting your Google Workspace Gmail communications. Thanks for listening and have a great Drupal Mountain Camp.
Thank you, Jutta.